Ghanaian President Akufo-Addo is advocating for African nations, including Ghana, to withdraw a minimum of 30% of their public funds and assets from foreign banks and deposit them in African financial institutions. The president emphasized that the current global financial architecture is unfavorable to African countries and hinders development financing. He further proposed investing at least 30% of each African state's sovereign reserves in African multilateral institutions like the African Development Bank, AfDB, and the African Export-Import Bank, Afreximbank. He linked this call to lessons learned from the COVID-19 pandemic's challenges in accessing development finance for economic recovery. Joining me for more on this is Paul Frimpong, Development Economist and Executive Director, Africa-China Center for Policy and Advisory. Thank you, Paul, for joining me today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
I mean, let's start with this. What do you make of the president's recent call, to his African counterparts?
Well, I think the call is timely, and I think the platform where he made the call makes it even more exciting in development. And I think it fits into some developing advocacies happening around how the global financial architecture has been structured and how our African continent and most developing countries, of course, African continent are marginalized out of this system. And the call for these global financial architecture to be revisited and drastic changes to be made, across the board, because we cannot keep having a conversation about how to mobilize financing and the funding towards African development and how much Africa needs, the gap that we need to fill in terms of investment and financing gap. We cannot keep having this conversation when the very system, the very system that creates the platform for this conversation is the cause or can do something about this situation. So for me, I think it was brilliant. The timing was good, especially at the AU summit where the continent is even trying to come up with another multilateral institution called African Investment Bank, in addition to the AfDB, the Afreximbank that we have, as we mentioned earlier. So I believe that it was a good call. And again, it connects to the recent advocacy that's happening around why there has to be a change in the existing global financial architecture. And for me, if you give me the chance, I can share more light on what is wrong with the current system and what can be done about it.
All right, let's look at this now. Why are these funds, deposited outside Africa in the first place? To what end is it, and what had been, the gains or otherwise so far?
Well, I think it's got to do with some of the, historical, structures that the continent, had going back to the colonial times, the kind of some of the deals that some of the countries had to sign to get their independence. It's all linked to that. When countries were trying to get political independence, of course, there were some economic short changes that they had to do at the time to be able to get independence. It wasn't given as we've seen. So obviously some of these are structured in that kind of format. Of course, even at the advent of the launching of the Bretton Woods Institution in 1944, which is the IMF, the World Bank, and sister institutions, some of these economic underpinnings were also made to some of these countries, and we have to sign on to it, right? I mean, it's not that all countries, of course. I'll give an example of Ethiopia, for example. Ethiopia is a country, of course, we all know is the only country that was colonized in Africa. Again, we'll look at Ethiopia as we speak, where the AU is, where this summit happened. They do not have foreign banks in Ethiopia. So everything is done in Ethiopia. So all the investment, everything, all the money stays in Ethiopia because they've not liberalized the financial service sector to allow foreign banks to operate in Ethiopia, right? And they're doing it. I mean, we can see that Ethiopia is not doing that bad compared to some other countries in the continent. So that wisdom that we needed to secure our future by shoring some money in these foreign lands, as a result that we believe that they have strong economic underpinnings that can back some of these assets that we have. Now, clearly we can see that that's not the case because we all at risk at various levels. We saw what happened in COVID-19. All the countries in the world were suffering and still suffering. So nobody is immune to any such shock. So why then do we still have to keep monies out there when we need investment in our country? Even if we don't trust, as you mentioned, that countries themselves can really manage these kind of reserves well, we can channel them through some of the multilateral institutions that we are all setting up, that we are all depending so much on, right? We take the African Development Bank, for example. They are the single and the leading multilateral investor in Africa's infrastructure financing, in the continent. right? Apart from the ones that come from other third parties like China.
All right, Paul, let's bring this home. You mentioned Ethiopia the other time, and I would like you to, talk more about some lessons that we can actually get from Ethiopia's, practice.
Yeah, I believe that the conversation is beyond just the Ethiopian example. Of course, that is the economic and the political right to decide that, okay, at this point in our development journey, we are not going to liberalize our financial services sector to allow any foreign players in the sector. Of course, they have liberalized other sectors that other foreign companies are all operating. So for them, I think it's purely for them, countries that have already liberalized their financial service sector, like Ghana and other countries, of course, we just have to back it with some relevant rules and laws that we believe will secure the financial future of our economies. But then again, as I said, this core, which is very important, as I said, it connects to everything that's happening to Africa at the global stage. Remember, last year, Africa was allowed or accepted to join the G20, now G21, and there are a lot of changes that have been made, right? Because even when countries on the continent are facing debt-related issues, and they approach some of these frameworks that are supposed to expedite, some of these restructuring of the debt and what have you, the countries have to stay in line for about 3 years because they are from African countries, right? In Zambia, the case of Zambia was there for 3 years. Ghana, we struggled for a couple of times. We have to go to the IMF for bailout before we're able to get a deal with the common framework, right?
Okay, Paul, I think it's time to okay, thank you. I think it's actually time, we started looking at the impact this move will actually have on African countries if they yield the call. I see you're already going there. So what's the impact? What are the things, we're expected to see should African countries yield this particular call within the continent?
I think it's very simple. The impact is that we need funding with a huge financing gap on the continent of Africa. We need funding. There's been calls and calls and calls. We're trying all means. Countries are under distress, right? But we cannot have assets sitting outside of the continent when we are suffering back home, right? So the core is, can we increase the quota? Can we reduce the quota out there and bring it back home through our own structure system that we trust? Because some of these institutions that he mentioned, that the AfDB, the Afreximbank, are Pan-African institutions that we trust. They're already delivering by their own resource mobilization, of course, contributing to member countries. But if we can increase that, it will be good for everyone. So I believe that's the first impact that we're going to see. Again, that can also develop into conversation about our membership in other multilateral institutions that also provide funding, like the IMF, right, like the World Bank. What is the quota of African countries in these institutions, right? And how can they also increase the African continent's share in that? That will also bring in more financing whenever we have to, the special drawing right. I mean, where we can draw on money that are sitting in the IMF. There's a small quota for the African continent. So for me, I believe that for the economic gains, it makes sense. We need funding. We have assets sitting out there. Why don't you plug into that and bring some home through our own channels so that we can get access to more funding to develop the continent?
All right, I like how you've talked about, the development banks in Africa already. And then first, I'd like to ask you if these banks are actually living up to, what is expected of them. And if not, what are the limitations and how can we address them?
I mean, on the surface, you can see that they're doing well. I mean, they've been at the forefront. I mean, I can mention the African Development Bank. They've been a key financier in terms of the continent's development. They always have the funding, doing billions of dollars, saying that they are leading, they are supporting a lot of countries on the continent. So I believe on the surface they are doing well. I think they need more capacity in terms of the pool of funding that they can have access to. And Africa can actually lead that charge. The continent, the leadership can lead that charge to ensure that these multilateral institutions that we've just mentioned can have access to more funding. Our own money sitting out there that we can get. The contribution that we are making to the IMF, the World Bank, we can advocate, ensure that we advocate to show that there's a reform at that level so that we can bring in more funding from that source to support. As it stands now, advanced or developed markets get access to more money than the entire African. In fact, Germany as a single country has access to more money to the IMF than the entire African continent of 1.4 billion people. How can that be? When we know that when you check the economic realities, the African continent needs more money, more funding than Germany. But Germany receives more from the IMF than the African continent combined. So that conversation needs to be had. And if you're able to push for such advocacy for that reform to happen, then we are going to be arming and also improving the activities of these multilateral development bank, AfDB and the Afreximbank.
All right, thank you so much, Paul. We have to anchor here. Thank you, Paul Frimpong, for sharing your thoughts with us today on the show.
Thank you for having me.
All right, we'll take a break now. When we'll come back, we'll bring you the gender tax conversation. Stay with us.